Dark is the most overrated word in anime and manga. It's become one of those tag words that people say over and over again, which is fine, but looking for stories that are exclusively dark kind of takes the fun out of reading manga. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that being dark was practically asking to be memed on. In fact, try and tell people on Twitter that Hunter x Hunter is a deconstruction of shonen. You will, without a doubt, get ratioed. But now with the release of Hell's Paradise, we have what fans have dubbed the Dark Trio, which also consists of Chainsaw Man and JJK. It's worth noting that this isn't a definitive trend, as we've seen manga like Chainsaw Man and Tokyo Revengers come out at roughly the same time. It's just that the community at large seems to lean more towards darker manga, and ridicule manga like Tokyo Revengers for being, quote, corny. But what's really weird about this trend is that people seem to pick and choose when dark is a good thing. Let's go back to my example of the DC universe. One of the reasons Marvel movies have dominated the mainstream is because the writers do a great job of including levity in between the tragic scenes. They go overboard in some movies, but it's still a recipe for success. Meanwhile, you have DC coming out with movies like Man of Steel, a movie that takes itself way too seriously. People like Superman because despite his godlike powers and silly costume, he's just like you and me. He tries to do the right thing, he loves his friends and family, and he really, really loves Christmas. So why is it that people laugh at DC for being dark but worship the Dark Trio? Well, as the manga industry has evolved, we've seen more and more dark stories in the mainstream. You could consider it a return to the era of manga like Fist of the North Star in the style of edgy 90s anime, but it's usually contrasted with the big three in more recent mainstream anime like Demon Slayer, Black Clover, and My Hero Academia. My Hero is probably the biggest offender as it has a crybaby protagonist, the heroes always seem to win, and it has an overwhelmingly optimistic tone. But My Hero is a really interesting case to look at because there's 3 instances where it made a sharp turn from kid-friendly cartoon to edgy comic book. The first, of course, was the introduction of Stain. People love Stain because he's a vigilante that exposes the hypocrisy of hero society, which makes sense. Hero society was taken for granted up until this point, so presenting readers with these sorts of questions added layers to the world and fleshed out the story, helping it to touch on even more ideas and emotions. Later on, Horikoshi would take this even further with what some people still consider their favorite arc, the Meta Liberation Army arc, or just the villain arc. The villain arc is special because it does what very few manga do. It presents an entire arc where the villains are the protagonists of their own stories. We're given a story from the perspective of the villains, revealing their backstories and helping us to see them as real people rather than just mustache-twirling bad guys. But then we get to the story after the big war, the Dark Hero arc. And you can kinda see where this turns into a meme. For hundreds of chapters, people hated Deku because he was a crybaby, but suddenly he puts on a mask, hangs out in alleys, and stops taking showers, and half of Twitter suddenly thinks he's becoming the next great shonen protagonist. Literally the same character, but you throw some dirt on him and give him a Batman voice and everyone thinks he's genius. My Hero was awesome before Dark Hero. It was fleshed out and touched on a number of mature themes and emotions. But when it seems like it's rebranding itself, people suddenly talk about it like it's a deconstruction of shonen. That is why the whole dark manga trend is ridiculous. Because it somehow propagates the idea that just because something is dark, it's somehow better than everything else. But that's why I bring up the example of My Hero. It's generally not considered a dark manga, and yet as we just explored, it has all of the same benefits. So there's a problem. The problem being that people say they want dark manga, but they're putting the tag word ahead of what they really want. What do people really want? Well, we can see it in the so-called Dark Trio. But before I explain what that is, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So let's talk about what makes the Dark Trio dark. Because lots of manga are dark, but like I said earlier, this term is mainly in response to the tropes of more mainstream shonen manga. When you make that comparison, 3 factors stand out. First and foremost, they're generally more graphic. JJK tends to have gruesome character deaths, Hell's Paradise is so graphic it's not even in Weekly Shonen Jump, and Chainsaw Man baffles people as to how it ever made it into the magazine before moving to Jump Plus. And you can see why this is an attractive trait. More gore and more action tends to mean more intensity and cooler looking fights. The second thing these manga have in common is that they're all tragic. Shonen manga tend to be more optimistic, with villains coming back as good guys, plenty of plot armor, the power of friendship, all that good stuff. But this isn't exactly the case in the Dark Trio. Each protagonist in the Dark Trio has a tragic beginning, and each story is filled with character deaths and many tragic moments. Finally, these manga tend to touch on more adult themes. Shonen manga are of course meant to be kid-friendly, so the Dark Trio can be distinguished by their willingness to dive into topics that you can't spell out for your younger readers. And this last one is the one you'll usually see the most. Like, when you see the classic One Piece versus Berserk debate, 9 times out of 10, you'll see people say that Berserk is better because it touches on more themes. There is, of course, a lot of truth to that argument, but it's also the kind of argument that gets regurgitated so that people can be the cool kid that sounds smart. The irony, of course, is that this argument ignores the fact that all of these elements are clearly present in mainstream shonen manga. The factors that are supposed to make the Dark Trio special can be found in any of your favorite shonen manga. In fact, you can find them in all of the big three, the manga that are supposed to be so different from the Dark Trio. Don't believe me? Well then, let's work our way down those 3 factors and make a series-by-series comparison. For the element of intensity, let's compare Hell's Paradise and Bleach. Hell's Paradise, as we discussed, is graphic. You don't have to read very much to see people get their heads chopped off or bashed in. What this does is make each chapter intense. In this messed up game of Total Drama Island, you don't know when someone will suddenly be taken out of the story, and of course it also makes the action scenes that much more intense. But guess what? The action is just as intense in Bleach. Characters slice each other up all the time. They are placed in near-death scenarios on a regular basis. And thanks to the talent of Kubo, the action is some of the most intense action to come out of any Jump series. Is it as explicit as the action in Hell's Paradise? No. Do characters actually die or get maimed as often as in Hell's Paradise? No. But gore itself doesn't suddenly make a story better. In fact, less gore can actually make a story better. In the world of fighting games, you have people who don't like Mortal Kombat because to them, the gore feels forced. Now, I'm not saying that anything is forced in Hell's Paradise, but you can see how gore doesn't magically make a series more mature. And this is true for the other 2 elements. On that note, let's move on to the element of tragedy. For this one, we'll compare Naruto and JJK. JJK is an interesting one because it's not that dark in its earlier chapters. Of course, Ouji has his tragic beginning. If you start with Volume 0, then it's definitely tragic. The death of Junpei is still one of the most insanely tragic moments in JJK. And of course, once you get to Gojo's past in Shibuya, you can almost hear that song All My Friends Are Dead playing in the background. Now, do characters die in Naruto as often? It's a close call, but they get saved a lot too. So for the sake of argument, we'll say no. And do things generally tend to turn out alright for the good guys in Naruto? Oh, absolutely. Not even a question. So in that regard, one could say JJK is more tragic because things don't always turn out okay. In fact, the odds are often against Ouji and the other characters. But no rational person, no person in their right mind, can honestly say that Naruto is not full of tragedy. You have the tragic birth of Naruto, you have the tragic fate of Zabuza and Haku, you have literally anything and everything even remotely related to the Uchihas. Maybe characters don't die as often in Naruto, and maybe Naruto has a more positive tone overall, but just because it's ultimately a positive story doesn't mean it's not full of tragedy. It goes back to the conversation about gore. Just because there might be more tragedy in JJK doesn't mean it's categorically better or more mature than Naruto. Naruto has some of the most tragic moments in manga, so to try and undermine those moments because it's generally a more optimistic story is painfully one-dimensional. And nothing makes this clearer than the third element, the element of mature themes and topics. And for this one, it's only fair that we compare One Piece and Chainsaw Man. The poster boy of Jump versus the manga littered with violence, sex, and all kinds of obscene nonsense. Now, does Chainsaw Man explore a lot of mature themes? 100%. Not only does it explore sexuality at a bunch of different angles, but it also explores death, identity, free will, toxic relationships, man versus society, existential dread, cosmic horror, enslaving children to work for the government. All of this turns what would otherwise be a goofy bloodbath into one of the most mature manga to ever come out of Jump. Now, is One Piece a dark series? Most people would probably say no. It's not that graphic, and while there's tons of tragic moments, it's also a very optimistic story. But are we gonna sit here and pretend like One Piece doesn't touch on just as many mature topics? And it doesn't just touch on these topics. Most of them are staples of the series. You have corrupt governments and their hypocrisy, you have identity and existential meaning, free will versus fate, religious meaning versus self-proclaimed gods. These are all regularly occurring topics. And they aren't just referenced, they are all thoroughly explored in the conversations between the characters. There is even an entire arc, that being Fishman Island, where racism and slavery are core themes of the arc. And not just blatant racism, but the structural racism and learned biases that feel all too familiar. Maybe One Piece doesn't explore adult themes as explicitly as Chainsaw Man, but for a series that's meant to be enjoyed by readers of all ages, I think portraying structural racism as honestly as One Piece does is a pretty good job. And that's really what the whole dark trend comes down to. The Dark Trio and other dark manga, they're just more explicit. They are intense, tragic, and mature stories, but they don't have a copyright on these factors. A story can be emotional and mature without explicitly depicting some of the more mature themes. Mob Psycho 100 isn't that explicit, but are you gonna tell me that a story like Chojin X is categorically better because of it? Gintama isn't nearly as tragic as Berserk, but it isn't definitively worse just because the characters always seem to find their happy ending. This is why dark is without a doubt the most overrated word in anime and manga. Making a story intense, tragic, and mature is guaranteed to make it more enjoyable, but adding more of a thing doesn't always mean it's better. In some cases, you can have too much of a good thing. And it goes both ways. As much as I love happy stories or down-to-earth protagonists, there are a ton of mainstream manga that feel generic because of it. But that doesn't mean that optimistic stories can't also be tragic. It doesn't mean that mainstream stories can't also explore the same adult topics. At the end of the day, it all comes down to a stylistic choice by the writer. It all comes down to the kind of story they want to tell and the kind of story we want to enjoy. You can have a story with tragic moments and mature themes that has a happy ending, or you can have a story with tragic moments and mature themes that doesn't have a happy ending. But just because one is more explicit than the other doesn't mean it's better. And that is why being dark is overrated. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Dark Trio is generally better than the Big Three. Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on why Fujimoto replaced Denji. In that video, I explain why Fujimoto needed a new main character for part 2. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.